Today marks the 70th anniversary of the adoption of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights by countries around the world. The document outlines 30 fundamental rights, which should form the basis of democratic societies. The UN says they're as relevant today as they have ever been, but with multiple examples of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Just how influential is the document? Mike Hanna reports.
Born out of recession, the devastation of war, and an act of genocide executed on industrial scale, the declaration was passed by the UN General Assembly in 1948, with the US Ambassador Eleanor Roosevelt a guiding force. Its intention to ensure that such tragedies did not occur again. But in the decades since, the declaration has been marked more by transgressions than example. The key problem, the lack of enforcement. The body established to protect these rights is the UN Security Council, an often divided body in which national agendas rather than individual rights remain supreme. A Syrian state that carries out chemical attacks against its own people is shielded from sanction by a Russian veto, which is joined by China in blocking any action against North Korea and in threatening a veto to hold the Myanmar military to account for what the UN's own investigators call a genocide. Any attempt to take action against Israel or even condemn it for transgressions in occupied territory is routinely blocked by a US veto. And even former champions of the declaration do not live up to their promise. The US president insists the maintenance of trade is more important than seeking accountability for a murdered journalist. The killing of Jamal Khashoggi contravened a number of articles of the declaration. Yet despite what many, including US senators, maintain is compelling evidence of guilt, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia remains unsanctioned.
Jamal Khashoggi is one of those cases where you look at it and you go, what is the point of fighting for human rights when, a man can walk into an embassy and be cut up into pieces and tortured and there's no accountability.
Article 14 states everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. But in what he describes as putting America first, President Trump is in daily transgression of the document a US ambassador helped draft 70 years ago.
As you know, multilateralism is under attack, and there are some pushbacks on human rights too. It gives me the impression that sometimes when some leaders of the world speak, relativizing human rights and saying that, or multilateralism, others feel like there's license to say it also.
70 years on, and the world may not be the better place the drafters envisaged. And yet the Universal Declaration of Human Rights remains as testament to what should be, a living reminder of the philosophy that individual rights are intrinsic and cannot be endowed or taken away. Mike Hanna, Al Jazeera, United Nations.
Let's speak to Andrew Gilmour. He's Assistant Secretary General at the UN Human Rights Office. We appreciate your time very much. I realize this is a very broad question, but how is the world currently doing in 2018 living up to the promise of this document?
Well, I just saw a very good bit of footage from your team there, and that's an accurate picture. I would say, and as you pointed out, this is the 70th anniversary of what, in my view, was the noblest document ever written. Now, there has been on a whole host of those rights, and those rights, those 30 articles, cover basically everything that one can aspire for on civil and political, but also right to food, right to health, right to shelter, and right to living wage. On many of those fronts, there has been almost dramatic progress, I would say, since this document was signed in 1948. The particular flourishing of rights happened from the late 70s and for the next perhaps 30 years after that. But as your program has showed right now, there is what I would say a backlash against human rights. And on the progress that was made, there's this almost a resentment on the part of many governments that this progress was made.
Yeah,
and we now see on a whole host of issues.
Why the backlash?
It's very hard to find out what it was that led to this. I would say that 9/11, the fact that people suddenly decided that fighting terrorism was more important than promoting human rights, and it wasn't just the United States, of course, but many countries took that view. And then when it was linked to the side effects, in a way, of the wars in Syria and in Iraq, and the migrants that came into Europe from both sub-Saharan Africa, but also from the wars in the Arab world, combined with the economic downturn, I think that is what led to the backlash, and the fact that even though today we've had great progress with this event in Marrakesh on migration, the fact that it is migration that Europe took it was historic embrace of human rights. It got rather relaxed, to put it mildly. And I think throughout the world, that this whole securitization of rights, to the idea that somehow security is more important than human rights. And a number of governments are using security as a reason to clamp down on human rights defenders, and indeed the press and other defenders.
Do you see a way for this resentment that you're talking about to be tamped down, to be reversed, just to sort of course correct? I mean, who can and should lead on that?
Well, at the moment, not that many governments, I have to say, are really showing, either by their actions or by their words, that human rights is at the core of their beliefs. But this, I think, will change, and the situation, though, however, will probably get worse before it gets better. And in the people, therefore, who are to pick up the slack, one just has to hope that NGOs and the press and human rights defenders, even though we recognize that they are under massive pressure, and it's growing in many parts of the world, the restrictions on their activity, the surveillance that is exercised on them is very worrying. But we're going to need voices, and therefore where there are free societies, we need people to speak up more than they've been doing, to stand up for their own rights, but also for those of others. I think while governments are having this restrictive approach, then we're going to need citizens where they are able to, without being under threat of imprisonment or worse, then they need to do some of the work that the governments are obviously not doing.
Mr. Andrew Gilmour, thank you so much for joining us from the United Nations. We appreciate it.